Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Setliff. I'm a professor of biology and entomology at Kutztown University. That's in eastern United States in the state of Pennsylvania. And I will tell you more about how I got involved with the project. But right now, I engage with our project mostly through teaching my undergraduate students, young people who are interested in conservation and getting involved in red listing. And I also have done a little bit of red listing myself. I'm interested in conservation, but I come at this as an academic who has taught about this in a strictly academic sense. And so my involvement is relatively new, but I find this to be extremely exciting. I was reading today that Rwanda has one of the youngest populaces in Africa, and one of our initiatives is to get more young people involved in red listing. And so what a great place. We need more people under the age of 30 to do this work, because so much of our expertise is aging out and retiring. And so this is an exciting time to get involved.
Excellent. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Monika Bohm, the third person in this little group that kind of somehow thought up this process, and now it's been growing into this bigger and bigger network, to be quite honest, which is super exciting to see. I'm based at the Indianapolis Zoo in a center called the Global Center for Species Survival, which is a collaboration between Indianapolis Zoo and the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And really my job at the moment is very much focused on supporting freshwater conservation activities within the Species Survival Commission. But that's not the only hat I have. On top of this, I'm also the co-chair of the Butterfly and Moth Specialist Group of the Species Survival Commission. I know, not very aquatic, don't swim too well. And also another group, a Red List Authority, that I will be telling you about in just a little bit. Prior to Indianapolis, I was actually working at the Zoological Society of London, and this is where my whole Red List journey started. I was actually just wanting to be a field ecologist, and then I got bogged down into red listing, and not really looked back since, to be quite honest. We were working on building biodiversity indicators that are based on IUCN red list assessments, so that we can track status of entire species groups over time. So that's my intro. Dave, I think you're in charge of driving this, right? So excellent, thank you. Right, so as I said, the IUCN is kind of, is this partner organization that I currently work with, and that obviously all of my red list work is involved in. The IUCN red list really is, the IUCN, first of all, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is one of the oldest and largest conservation organizations in the world. It's quite a unique organization. It's got this mix of government departments and NGOs all working together on all aspects of nature conservation. And it is organized into different commissions, and these commissions all focus on a different part of nature conservation. So for example, ecosystems or protected areas or education and so on. By far the largest though of these is the Species Survival Commission, and that's probably also the one that most people are quite familiar with. The Species Survival Commission really is looking at any aspects of species conservation, and how they are organized is into different specialist groups. There are quite a lot of them, as you can see from this slide. There's more than 140 specialist groups. They generally focus on a taxonomic group. Dave already mentioned the bat specialist group. I already mentioned the butterfly and moth specialist group, for example. There's also some groups that are more organized regionally. That's particularly the case for plant specialist groups that are generally looking at the fauna, the flora of a particular region. Sorry, I'm a little bit tired this morning, not enough sleep. And then there's a few other interesting specialist groups as well that focus on invasive species and so on, so some cross-cutting groups. Now, can you go to the next slide, please, Dave? Now, as I said, I'm quite interested, well, I'm mainly working freshwater issues right now, but when I started red listing, although I started out working on mammals when I was a field ecologist, my focus got to the smaller and smaller things and much more into the invertebrate realm. And when we look at invertebrates, for example, within the Species Survival Commission, these are the kind of specialist groups that we have. This number has actually grown immensely over the last few years, which is absolutely fabulous to see. So, for example, very recently, we got things like the firefly specialist group and the ladybird specialist group joining the ranks, and the wild bee specialist group, and so on. But if you look at all of the ones that are depicted here on this slide, there's obviously a lot of things that aren't covered by specialist groups. And this is where this Red List Authority comes in that I also co-chair. And that's the Terrestrial and Freshwater Invertebrate Red List Authority. It's always a little bit of a mouthful, so I always have to take a deep in-breath before I say that. Dave, next slide, please. So these specialist groups, their remit really is focused on their taxonomic group. The Terrestrial and Freshwater Invertebrate Red List Authority, its remit is to support the expansion of invertebrate assessments for the IUCN Red List, especially those that are not yet covered by any specialist group. And that, to be quite honest, is a lot, because you can see that it's not that many beetle specialist groups that have been established yet. So I always say, as Turla, as we call ourselves, because it's shorter to say, we're vastly outnumbered, right? And so when Dave reached out to me and said that he had a group of students that were interested in doing Red List assessments, I was immediately on board. I think it's very important that we kind of start finding new ways in which we can link more people in to ensure that some of these groups, and it doesn't have to be invertebrates, that some of these groups that are lagging behind in red listing, it could be plants, it could be fungi, it could be a mammal group where there's not enough manpower to run these assessments, that we really find new ways of linking new people in with new energy and new enthusiasm to help us facilitate these red list assessments. Next slide, please, Dave. I have no idea what's coming next. Oh, you, good. That's all from me for now.
So you want us to take over from here, or you want to run this?
Well, you put that in, so you run that.
All right. Thanks, Moni. So Moni gave a great introduction there, and this is just a few slides to give you insights into where we stand currently in Rwanda. Okay, and so there's about 2,266 species formally on the red list as of a couple nights ago. And you can see kind of where this stands. Most of them are in the animal kingdom, but we do have a few plants and a total of 2 species of fungi. And just drawing on the animals, mostly the chordates, smaller percentage of the arthropods. And if you're looking at the chordates, you can see where it all kind of falls out. Predominantly the birds. And this really comes down to, there has been an active initiative by the bird people, by BirdLife International in particular, to really keep the assessments current and to get new ones updated on an ongoing basis. Okay? And so this is part of an idea to give you a vision of where the assessments are, but also that there are opportunities for people to make some efforts and make progress. And it really is about individuals or groups taking action. So I don't know how many species are described in Rwanda, but there's 2,200 species that are assessed, many of these that you're going to see in just a moment need new assessments. But there are so many undescribed species or species that have been described that have yet to be assessed. I was poking around and prepping for this seminar, and I discovered this recent paper from 2015, so a survey of praying mantises in Rwanda. And I think there were several, I think it's 15, I didn't put it in here. But there's a lot of new species that are currently being assessed, or excuse me, that are recently described in Rwanda. Have any of these been assessed? No. You know, I looked again to see what has been done in Rwanda, and there is only one praying mantis that finds itself in Rwanda that has been assessed. And in 2015, there was this, you know, wonderful paper describing many new ones. I don't know how many are in Rwanda, but the point of this is, here's a gap, here's recent information. Okay? If we want to look at this in a slightly different way, you know, these are all surveys that you can do within, again, or within the red list. Okay? And so just to orient you here on the red list category, for those 2,200 species, you know, the vast majority of them are 1,995 are in the least concern category, but you have 15 critically endangered, 77 endangered. How does it look by year? This is the real promising part to me, is within the last 7 years or so, there's been a big initiative, big push to get a lot of assessments done. And what we saw is that a lot of it is related to the birds, but there's also a global tree initiative that's been moving forward, and there's some others, a butterfly initiative that Moni was discussing. But as you can look back down through time, we have assessments that are on the red list that are there from 1996. And these are the species that are getting overlooked. These are the known species that have been assessed that are getting overlooked. And this is a need for greater action in my mind. Okay. And again, if you look in more recent times, there is this push to get things done. You know, here's just a couple of them. This one in particular, here's Hill's horseshoe bat. This is one that I facilitated the assessment of based on colleagues that have worked with colleagues in Rwanda. This is an endemic bat that is found in Ngwe Park. Okay. But point of this information is these reassessments are needed. Not only do we have the need for assessment of species that are not yet, that are described but not on the red list, we have this significant need for reassessments. Okay. Excuse me. If you want to think about this through the lens of just those threatened species, again, just the 15 critically endangered, endangered species 77, vulnerable 91, you'd hope that these are the ones that are in the more recent category. But once again, if you look, there's a fair number that are not being assessed. We don't know what their current status is because, excuse me, some of them are 30 years old. Okay? These older assessments, in fact, are just placeholders. They were put on there, expert opinions suggesting, you know, this is a vulnerable species, and in, you know, blunt terms maybe, they've been forgotten. Okay. So, excuse me, just a second.
I can pick up here, Dave, if you want me to.
Thank you. I need my voice is going for a second. Go for it.
I'm going to ask you just to go back one slide because I wanted to add one more comment to that. That was an excellent review there, and I appreciate that. So one of the things that I was just noticing with the mantid religiosus, of course, that's an animal with very broad worldwide distribution. And so that assessment is not focused on Rwanda. It doesn't probably contain excellent information about the animal's distribution there. And so even in these cases, and that may be true for many of these assessments, where these animals occur broadly throughout the region or throughout the world, and another way to contribute to those would be to add more accurate information, specific locality, distribution, ecology information for your country that would improve the quality of these assessments, because they're all works in progress, and they can all be better, especially when we have someone in halfway around the world making an assessment regarding something that lives in your country. You're on the ground, you have the ability to, what I like to say, ground truth these assessments and give us more confidence in them. So that's what I wanted to start with that one. And thanks. We can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm here to talk about today how I got involved and a little bit about the way that we do red list assessing in my system as an example. And really, it's just an example. It's one way to go about doing this. And we have, since we've gone ahead of you a little bit, we have encountered barriers. We begin to talk about some of the things that our network is experiencing, and we're realizing that not everyone experiences the same problems and issues. So you can take my story as an example, but we will also return and talk about, how is REST going to work for you and your institute and your people and your experts, and who's going to be doing that at the end. So there are a number of perceived barriers, and I am guilty of this. I mentioned at the beginning that I had taught about the red list as an academic in my courses. So I taught my students about it, but I had never imagined that I would be involved in the process itself. And beyond that, I never imagined my students. It's one more there, Dave. So there are a number of things that was in my mind. I thought that I wasn't a pure conservationist. I'm more of an applied entomologist, but I was interested in conservation. I was interested in the insects in the regions of the world where I had worked, and I certainly feel passionate about having them listed, and I want them to be protected if that's needed. And so this was not something that I thought was for me. It wasn't for me or my students. It was something my students could aspire to. I could encourage them to seek it out, but I really thought this was soundly in someone else's abilities and beyond my reach. And it really is, I'll tell you how I got into it in a moment, but I assumed that there were experts who were knocking out these assessments somewhere, in a far away, and this was happening, but not that I wasn't ever going to be a part of this process. I didn't know where to start, and really this is a perceived barrier that's actually quite a thin door to walk through. It wasn't difficult to figure that out. It was just knowing to whom to speak and where to go next, and that's what working with Moni and Dave has helped me figure out. Other barriers that have come up because I first, as we've started to develop our network, we've reached out to our colleagues, and I've reached out to colleagues here in the United States, some in my own university, and I've had some pushback. Why would I do such a thing? Where is the value for my career? And I was kind of taken aback by that. I see immediate value for my students who are interested in conservation, want to build a professional network with people around the world, want to work internationally. It was a very intuitive thing for me to say, this has got incredible value for my students. It has incredible value for me. But I'm a tenured faculty member, and I'm not an early career person trying to establish my research. I have a research program that's already established. And so many of my younger colleagues said, where's the value? And so these are questions that we are we're beginning to address, we're beginning to talk about, we're beginning to try and change the idea. All right, Dave, if you can advance to the next slide, please. So I come into this back in 2019, this project. Dave was working at my university, and we had similar interests and overlap. We had traveled and worked in some of the same regions of the world. And so we struck up conversation that developed into a friendship. And we had decided that in summer of 2020, we were going to take some Kutztown students, my university students, our university students, to Fiji, a country that he had worked in recently, and I was interested in working in because it overlapped with some of my expertise in the field of entomology. So we laid out a careful plan. We got funding, and we set out to do this. And of course, you know this as well as I. The summer of 2020 was not a very nice time for travel for the world. This was, of course, when COVID swept the world, and our plans ended. We essentially had the option of returning our grant funding and stopping the project, or completely redesign it. And so, again, I was working from this assumption that red listing was beyond the reach of me and my students. And Dave pierced that veil for me and just said, no, that's something we can absolutely do. And so as the conversation, you can advance to the next part there, we began to develop a new plan. And the plan was essentially to COVID-proof our work. And since we couldn't go to the field and do the field research aspect, we would work on the red list assessments. And we would involve students in our classes, research, independent study projects, however we could. And we would get them pulling together information, trying to build an assessment, make an argument. And then on the other end, Dave and I, at this point, were beginning to reach out to various expertise. We first talked with Moni, and she, again, another barrier that I perceived was that I was going to try and work with this enormous bureaucratic, institution, the IUCN, that had, I thought of it as the spaceless thing. I had no way in, and turns out Moni was great. She was a wonderful way to interact with the system. She made it easy for us. She brought us in and was excited to have us there. And all of those things were a surprise to me. Our project began to grow, and we initially had 9 undergraduate students. They produced products. We got 3 assessments out of them in our first year of the project. I have 5 new students who've joined the original 9. I've had a few of them graduate, but so we're keeping, we have 5 new students who've come in this year, and they're working. We've just submitted a new assessment just a few days ago, and more of the drafts are coming in. It's an exciting time because, as I said, some of the initiatives for the IUCN are to increase the number of people under the age of 30 working on red list, the assessors. And I see a way for me to contribute to my students to sort of feed into that need. The other aspect of my part is, and the thing that we learned very quickly, is that my students needed help, and working with people around the world, meeting with and engaging with experts, taxon experts, specialists all over the world has been such an exciting thing, because my students here in Eastern Pennsylvania are working with people in Bolivia and in the Caribbean and in Fiji and in Papua New Guinea and all over the world, and hopefully Rwanda. So I'm looking forward to developing those professional networks as we continue to grow. So that leads us to the next slide. So our system of using red listing and training young students and young researchers, young career researchers, but also reaching out to retired researchers on the other end of the spectrum, people who are done with their sort of principal careers, but are looking for some way to contribute to conservation. We've begun to reach out to a whole host of people, and we've had quite a bit of success. You can see from this map here, the stars indicate where our nodes currently are, and where we hope they will be soon. We're establishing some of these as we speak. Our next node from Fiji, from the experts in Fiji, was the Philippines, and from there we have just seen sort of this concept grow, and we have teams working around the world to work on underrepresented taxa that Moni mentioned at the top of the lecture, of the presentation, excuse me. But these underrepresented taxa are important. They're missing from the red list, and they make our meta-analyses and things like that difficult because we don't have information on these important groups. And these groups are going to help. They're already beginning to produce red list assessments for their countries, for their regions, and it's been a great opportunity for all of us. Next slide, please. And so if you are where I was not that long ago in 2019 and wondering how do we get this started, I think many of you are actually already have a head start. You've done some national work, and so the barriers may not be the same for me. I'm not going to assume that they are, but really the first step is to confirm that you're interested and you want to be engaged, and that's already done. So congratulations. We welcome you. Heartily welcome you to the network. We really do enjoy seeing this grow. And then we start talking to people. We're just the start of this, sort of the tip of the spear. But we are able to get you set up. We can get things started. We can talk to you about training and how to implement red listing in different scenarios inside of your committees or your groups, in your classrooms, individually. However it works for you is very important. And that's literally the next piece there is you're going to develop a strategy that works for you and the expertise and the manpower that you have. Okay, go ahead, Dave. All right, so I think this is where I wrap it up. But if you're wondering where to start, we've done many different things in the different places that we've worked. We've had many different suggestions. Sometimes you have taxa already picked out where you already have information. Sometimes you do not. You don't know where to start. This seems a bit trivial now, but when we first began, we had no idea which taxa to pick. And so we were working in Fiji, and we decided, let's start by looking at in Fiji the money and the stamps, all of the things that people in Fiji have recognized, and see all the animals that they put on stamps and money, and let's get those on the red list. It seems a bit trivial now, but it was a starting point. And we began to look at some of these species because we felt these species were important enough to the people in the country to warrant, attention. And we felt that was a great place to start. We now know that, we can talk to experts. They can tell us this animal needs attention, or this plant is falling through the cracks. We need this animal to be better protected. And so by talking to people in museums or university professors, ecologists, field biologists, they can tell you what's needed. And I think that's where I wrap it up, and I'll pass it back over to you, Dave.
Excuse me. All right. Thank you, Greg. And apologies for my voice. I just got back from a trip. But there's a lot of ways to approach this. As someone who's worked around, been very privileged to work with a lot of different people from around the world, I'm a real believer in those trusted partners. Without the support, friendship, guidance from Moni, our efforts for the red list would have fallen flat. And so as you are developing your vision, and I hope that we can help you in that process, but it really is a vision for who do you trust in the world within Rwanda to help you, because they are going to have expertise and knowledge that you may not have. I'm not an insect person. I'm more of a bat person, but I have a piece to play in our collaboration, and hopefully we can contribute our skills to this initiative. But by working together with these experts, with those other organizations, you have better assessments, You have benefit from one another. There's support and guidance. When you run into a problem, there's solutions. The challenges can be resolved. And, you know, it's also this idea of you develop these amazing personal and professional networks that will span the world and last a lifetime. And especially from a student perspective, I think that it really helps students, whether you're here in the United States, there in Rwanda, or over in Fiji. Excuse me. It doesn't matter. It really helps to broaden perspectives, help you look at things through different ways. So there's ways that people grow through this experience by engaging with experts and people from around the world. You know, as Greg mentioned, you know, where do you start? There's a sea of species out there in Rwanda, and you don't have to limit yourself to Rwanda. You could get engaged elsewhere. But where do you start? Is it those national symbols, those cultural symbols? Maybe there's the recent descriptions of the praying mantis that we mentioned. Maybe someone in Rwanda has a research project that is already going on, working with a species that is not assessed. But point of all this is think about where and how you want to get started and do things that will also benefit your initiative. Get your initiative attention for what you're doing, because then it can lend in or provide a positive feedback loop. You know, our colleagues in Fiji, you know, they took the red list assessments that we did and they informed the government. The government was already informed about them because they participated in the assessments, but they took it to the next level, raising the awareness of what's going on, which is having huge positive benefits for us. As we're starting out here, and Moni mentioned, you know, there's this huge number of different specialist groups and authorities. How do you navigate something like that? That's one of those perceived barriers. Well, people can help you figure out, who do you contact? If I don't know who to contact, you know who I go to? Moni. She knows someone who can help us get to the right person. And so when we're starting the assessments, you know, it's not that everything runs through Moni. It would be great if everything did, but it doesn't. We have to go to the coordinators for the different taxonomic groups to find the right entry point. And across the board, they're great to work with. This is a great example in my mind of what I love about this. We started an initiative to look at 5 species of stag beetles in the Pacific. And we were using this paper by Chris Reed as a seminal paper to guide our assessments. And Greg and I, we finally reached out to him. And guess what? Instead of him being a reference in the papers, he's now an active contributor to the assessments, which is huge to have that personal expert knowledge as part of the initiative, not as a reference in the bibliography. And not only that is, he's now feeding us additional species that he thinks would be of value to help to get onto the red list. So there's a lot of spin-offs that can be amazingly important in the work that you're doing. So, you know, I think we're wrapping up here, and hopefully we've given you a few ideas. The big questions, I think, is what do you want your approach to be? It has to be right for you. I've tried it in different ways, and in every country we work with, every partner, there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of differences as well. You can set it up as individual projects. Several of us are trying it as class projects. You may take more of the traditional IUCN approach of these larger workshops, but there may be other models that are right for you in Rwanda, especially as you're starting out. And our final message is, you know, we have to be willing to recognize those challenges. You know, what is the barrier? But we have to resolve those challenges. We can't just say, oh, it's a problem, therefore I can't do this. You know, many of us have hit those walls, those brick walls to progress at different points in time. We can accept those barriers and do not make progress, or we can work with people, find solutions, and move things forward. And you know, you guys are here because of your interest in Rwanda's biodiversity, and you're not accepting those barriers. You're talking about how do we move things forward, and I think that is just a wonderful place to be, and I hope that we can contribute to your efforts, either as advisors or as engaged collaborators. So I think, Moni, do you want to, any ending comments, or Greg? Because I'm done talking.
I think I would just ruin the lovely final statement of do not accept barriers, because I fully agree. That's just a wonderful sentiment to finish it off on. As Dave and Greg said, I think it can be quite overwhelming. When I started, never thought I would be that much involved in red listing. It just happened as part of my job, kind of organically. But over time also, it was interesting to see how many people perceive, like Greg said, that it's just some expert somewhere else doing these assessments, right? And it kind of is, but these experts are incredibly busy people who need all the help they can get. And I think it's really important that we diversify, inform, train people about the red list, so that we get more and more capacity into the system from all over the world as well. And that it's not just somebody in some ivory tower sitting and doing the assessment.
And I'll just add that, and I agree, I think this is an excellent place to end, but I'll add one more statement here. This is also the beginning of a project. The red list itself, the red list assessment, is the beginning of a project. It is a wonderful place for your granting agencies and your research groups to build around. Once the assessment's there, you know, Dave mentioned getting government action, getting a species on the national endangered species list. This is a wonderful impetus for such a thing. But even for my students, now I am looking at the end of COVID, or so we hope, and I'm thinking it's time to think about getting my students back out into the field. I still have my original dream of taking students to these countries and doing work, but now I have so many more options in front of me, because these assessments beg for answers. Because one of the things we add in them is, we don't know the answer. We don't know what the host plant of this animal is. You know, for me, my insects, that host plant could mean the difference between endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable. And so we are making an assumption, and then we need to find out. And so I want to work with people in country, and I want my students to want to do that as well. So what a wonderful way to close that loop. That's a really important part of it as well. So it's just the beginning of the process.
So we'd love to open it up for questions here. Otherwise, we'll just keep chatting on opportunities and ideas, shared experiences. But we would like to, hear from people if you have questions.
Great. Thank you so much, all the three of you. And we have some virtual clapping for you. I'm really excited, and I know my colleagues in the center are, to look at the possibility of, well, more than just the possibility of really moving forward with this. It's really in line with many other activities in the center and in the government here in Rwanda. So I would like to ask if anybody here has a comment. You can put it in the chat, or you can unmute and say your comment now. I only just was able to reconnect, so I can't really see any chats that came, I don't know, before like 10 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago. And I do see, Philippe, thank you. You mentioned about interested in assessing critically endangered fish in Rwanda. And Philippe, you're a great candidate to get that started. And Philippe has been research with fish here, and he just submitted a proposal for a research project on the endangered upside down Rusizi catfish. So that's one example where I think, Philippe is really in a good place. And I would like to ask Dave and Moni and Gregory if they're willing to mentor us. We could set up a way to get some support from all of you to know how to really engage with this, kind of as Greg you were saying how you are newly started this as an academic and working with your students. I just find that a really exciting model, and I think Philippe could be in a really same position for that. But I want to say, maybe we can have a discussion about how we can do that with you. And I know you might mention us doing those modules, IUCN modules, which I'm going to set up a structure where we can get people to start doing those. But Ajid, you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Oh, yes. I can't see anyone. The screen is still shared, or yeah, maybe. Okay. Yeah. First of all, thanks for our speaker. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I like this the center of bringing multiple speakers on the same day, which is really good. So my question, actually, any of the speakers can answer the question. I'm an air quality scientist, and during the pandemic, lockdown, we have been seeing an improvement in terms of air quality as people were locked down. For conservation perspective, all species, what do you think COVID lockdown has been affected the species? Does that impact same in developed countries compared to developing, or global north to global south? What do you think?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
No, I couldn't quite hear on my end. So go ahead, Greg.
Well, I heard it. I think I can sum up. The impacts of COVID and the changes in global use on conservation status of organisms. I think it's a difficult question to answer. There's many factors that contribute to decline of species, and one of the things I'm learning, I've now, I don't come at you with a ton of expertise. I've only been involved now in maybe 10 assessments total, and most of those are in the draft format. But what I'm seeing is that most of the threats that we're identifying for our species are long-term. They have to do with land use and management decisions that have been going on sometimes for decades. And in some cases, we have processes that have corrected themselves, but are still the organism hasn't adjusted its population in response yet. So I think it may be a bit too soon to tell, but it's an interesting question, one that we'll need to keep looking at.
Yeah, I think I would add, the impacts of COVID, while to me, it showed the world that we could make positive impacts. We don't necessarily have to go to that extreme measure to have positive impacts on species, but ultimately, as soon as the restrictions lift, the disturbances come right back. And so it's often a short-term positive impact. In other situations, it exacerbated the situation as well. Because I know in Fiji, there's a big push for greater farming to remove the social connection with going to the cities. And so it increased pressures on biodiversity.
I want to go to another question. Thank you for that question, Ajid. And Goretti asked a really, really interesting question that I know you talked a little bit about, but maybe you could talk again about this. She's asking who is considered as expert to carry out an assessment, who to talk to in case One wants to do a national red list assessment, and which can contribute to regional and global assessments.
Right. Okay. So first of all, and I think this is a really common misconception, is anybody with the knowledge on that species can do a red list assessment for a species. So in many ways, the red list functions very much like it would if you submitted a journal manuscript, for example, to a publisher. In reality, most of the assessments, of course, are run through this Species Survival Commission Specialist Group Network and various other IUCN-led assessment processes. But in theory, and also quite often in practice, anybody can submit a red list assessment. So really, anybody can be a red lister, which is why this initiative is so great. It's really just kind of trying to get people connected into the network to make the whole process easier and smoother to run through.
And if I can add in here, and I think it's, while anyone can do it, I think it's really important that it's our responsibility as people outside of the red list authorities and specialist groups, coordinate with them, because there may be hidden initiatives that the public isn't aware of, that assessments are already moving forward. And so you don't want your work to be marginalized or disregarded because someone else has already started it. Trust me, there is a ton of opportunity. It's just a little bit of form planning and coordination will make everything run much smoother.
Yeah, like in the example of freshwater fish, for example, there's currently a global freshwater fish assessment ongoing. So with any assessment processes looking into freshwater fish, for example, I would start by looking at what's already on the red list, and then I would start by asking somebody on the inside, that could be me, for example, to see if there's already assessments ongoing, because we have the connections to find this out, and that will just smooth the process so much, because there are lots of these assessment processes ongoing, and while they're still in progress, nobody can see what's underway, really. I forgot what the second part of that question was. There was something about national red listing.
Well, I think that was it, is how you connect a national red listing to the global and regional and global assessments. But I think you touched on that as well. But I think the main thing is you're highlighting that we should feel enabled to do that. We have a lot of people here, as you can see in the chat. We've really been focused on building taxon expertise. So we have now people who are experts in fish and land snails, amphibians, diatoms, different insect groups and pollinators. So I'm really trying to think about ways to encourage these researchers, these young scientists, to get involved, as you're saying. And thanks, Dave, for posting that module list. And as I mentioned, I think we'll do something kind of coordinated here in the center to encourage people to do those modules. I wanted to see if there's any other. Thanks, Moni, you shared your email so people can pick that from the chat. And then I will also send an email around to our research associates and fellows with those contacts. And maybe we would look at how we could organize maybe another more focused meeting to talk about nuts and bolts after people do the modules. I see that, Antoine, you've got a question.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you for organizing this kind of seminar. I really enjoy it. And as I am interested in biodiversity, I would like to ask, how can we decide that this species belong to red list? Thank you.
You want to take that, Moni?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question. Can somebody?
You see, for instance, there is a lot of species in the list of in red list. So how can we decide, for instance, if we are working here in Rwanda and we say that this species can be included in the red list? How it happened? Thank you.
So most of the red list, many of the species that appear on the red list have been part of some sort of assessment process. And that's quite often IUCN-led assessment processes. Like, for example, you will see that there's more and more trees appearing on the red list. That's because there's a global tree assessment currently happening. All of the specialist groups, well, at least within the mammal sphere, will contribute updated red list assessments for their species to the red list. And really what you can kind of see on the red list is how this specialist group network has grown, and hence more species come in from slightly more obscure groups that have previously been underrepresented, but also on the kind of focus areas of some IUCN-led processes. Sorry, I have real trouble speaking today. For example, at some point there was like a pollinator initiative in Europe and an initiative to get more invertebrates on. So you will see a lot of invertebrate assessments from Europe on the IUCN Red List, for example. So it's very much focused like this, and also based on who really gets interested in red listing. So I think talking to, for example, the entomological community will be really, really interesting, because suddenly you probably kind of hit on somebody who really loves a particular taxon group. Goes like, you know what? I would really love to see these species assessed for the IUCN Red List. And that then is how you spur these assessments. That's my 2 cents on this. Dave probably wants to add something.
I can add. I have one.
Greg does. Okay, good.
So great.
So, if I may, Antoine, a great question, and I've had this discussion among my colleagues, some of whom have come back at me and they question the value of putting a species, especially one that is not threatened. And I personally see the value of putting every species on the red list. And I think there's something to be learned in that process, if anything, to put down baseline data. So one of the things I wanted to say is that species does not need to be endangered or qualify for threatened. It needs, the assessment is not only about that. It's about putting down the state of our knowledge about that organism. And even if that species is stable at the moment, there's no guarantees that that's true for the future. We can still identify potential threats. We can talk about, and again, many of these things will come through in the training that Dave has posted. The modules there are excellent. They'll help you to better understand what they're really doing with the red list. It's not only an endangered species list. The species that I've just submitted is going to qualify for least concern, and I have no problem with that. That species deserves to be on the red list. And now there's another question that may be in there. As you start, what are good candidates species? And that's a slightly different question that I also think is worth noting. As you look at species that you're working with, what I did in my group was I stuck with species that were endemic and not found over a broad geographic region, just because this made it easier for us to conceptualize the status of the species. It was a much smaller project, and this made it a good candidate. Other species have more data. If you have data on the species, then it makes it much easier to write an assessment than if there's very little known. And so I discovered my students with species with very little data were becoming frustrated. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to formulate them. And it is more difficult to write those assessments, I believe. So if you're looking for good candidate species to start with, they're species that you know, and species that you have close to you that may not exist elsewhere. Those species we need to know. From in my heart, all I care about are that assessments are out there so that we have assessments and species remain on the landscape or out in the world because we now know that they're what they are. Even if they're healthy, we know that. And then we can come back. Assessments are often updated every 5 to 10 years, and come back in 5 to 10 years and say, look, the species was healthy 10 years ago. How is it now?
And just quickly to add to this, from my previous life at ZSL, where we used the red list to be, well, to see if we can build indicators of how entire species groups, for example, are doing over time. For that process, of course, for the red list index, entire species groups are to be assessed so that we can then see over time how the extinction risk within that group changes. And so least concerned species are very important to know about as much as the critically endangered ones. Same with the process that I worked on, which was essentially using some sort of a random sample from really species-rich groups to get an idea of which groups are more threatened than others, and then also which ones are potentially declining fastest, and so on and so forth, and to feed this into global policy, for example. So because of this, there will also be a lot of least concerned species on there, and it doesn't mean that they're not declining and that they're just perfectly fine. They're just potentially sometimes the next in line to see deteriorations.
A couple more comments here, and just to reemphasize, as Greg said, the red list is often perceived as, well, it's only threatened and endangered species. No, it is for everything from data deficient to extinct. And if they're not on there, they're not considered in global assessments and management decisions, etc. Here in the U.S., one of our most abundant bats is now considered threatened and endangered because of an introduced fungus. 10 years ago, it was the least concerned species. Now it's endangered. If we're not watching the least concern and those really abundant species, we can lose them. As Hillary said, they climb up that list of threat status. What species goes on there? Make sure that they're a good recognized species, because those wonderful taxonomists, they're always changing what is accepted taxonomy. So we need to make sure that it's a, quote, currently recognized as a good species, and then it's fair game. The question about where do you start, that's for really where do you want to start. I would probably suggest a combination, but really think about it from your personal areas of expertise, personal areas of interest, national priorities, and there's many different ways, and there's enough people on this group and this wonderful set of questions that are coming in that there's so many entry points. And for myself, and I think I'm speaking for my friends Moni and Greg, we're here to help you in this process, working closely with you, advising, supporting, whatever it takes. And we've had successes and we've had our struggles in making our own progress, and we're there to help you move it forward. And so having some of your internal discussions, of which we'd happy to be part of, but can help you find your path forward.
Great, thank you. That's really fantastic. I saw that, I think Tassien has a question. He said, will you update first the species that are already listed, then go with new species? Or, how would you approach that? And then there are many criteria to consider when classifying species under the IUCN red list categories. Many people will need training on species classification. And so he's asking, will you provide training? So I can just mention there is the modules that Dave and his colleagues mentioned. So we should first do those modules, and then our questions will probably be a little bit deeper. But maybe one of you wants to tackle this question from Tassien.
Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Go ahead, Mom. Go ahead, Monika.
Yeah, it's that's absolutely fine. It's a question that I have pondered for the Terrestrial and Freshwater Invertebrate Red List Authority a lot of times. Are we going to update the species already listed and then go on with the new species? I think, again, it's a mix of the two, because it entirely depends on what current expertise I've got access to. Now, just as a disclaimer as well, I'm not really a trained invertebrate biologist. I was very much a vertebrate person beforehand. And so really I fell into this, and I'm very, very reliant on the expertise around me. And I know that other people always know better. And that's, I think, always a first great step to make anything work really, really well, when you know that I very much have my limits. But yeah, it's at the moment I've started looking into trying to find ways in which we can update some of these really old assessments that Dave was talking about. In fact, just recently, a local university professor here, he reached out to me to give an intro for one of his courses that was on red listing about the IUCN red list. So I gave that to his students, and then he also mentioned during that session, and then later on we'll do some hypothetical red list assessments so that everybody can have a go. And I was like, hang on a minute, we are not doing hypothetical red list assessments when there's so many species to assess.
Real one.
Yeah, I was like, please do not say this. So we discussed with him, for example, what might be good species to look at. And he's based in North America. So I looked at some of the really old, outdated North American assessments that maybe some of his students could kind of start putting better assessments together and start drafting those, for example. And I think it is literally a mix based on where the expertise lies. I don't lose too much sleep over some of these really old assessments. I know they kind of nag me in the back of my head. But it's equally as important to get some of these newly described species on the red list as soon as possible. They're only recently described quite often for a reason, and that's because they're very restricted in range, for example, and there might be threats already impacting them. So it's really important to get those on as well.
Yeah, and if I can, I like the approach of multiple taxonomic entry points, because group of people that are on the call all want it to be listing. Well, there's a great here, and if we said we're only going to focus on one taxonomic group, maybe the majority of the people here would feel left out. There's plenty of need and opportunity. It's just about how you want to ease into this. And then, as I agree with Moni's philosophy of those past assessments, but if some of those past assessments are critically important species to get updated, then they should be part of the priority set. And that's really where, from your perspective, you have that better sense of what is really the most important areas of interest, conservation concern, etc., from your perspective is for Rwanda. That should not be done from yahoos like me sitting over here in the US. You have that knowledge, you know what is important and where you want to try and mobilize your expertise, because this initiative isn't intended to be a one and done sort of thing. We want this to last a long time. We want you to find success, and that these assessments move forward year after year after year. And that comes with you feeling good about what you're doing, what you're achieving.
Yeah, and I'm paying attention to the time here. We like to stay to an hour, but I did want to there's some really interesting comments that people posted after the three of you have been speaking. So Jana May mentioned that he feels he found himself in the near future as a red list scientist in Rwanda. So I think that's really hopeful that this talk has sort of empowered some people here to feel they can do that, and he hopes he can get connected. So I think there's definitely the energy to stay connected here and Prosper with his land snail research, of course, Philippe with his fish research, And then I also, I remember there's a comment down here, Hillary, who's been working with us with bird identification. She was mentioning that often least concern often gets raised. And I think that comment really goes to the point of then linking the red listing process to the government, and conservation strategies, which is something we're also really interested in doing, is really using the red list once it's produced and updated assessments to guide conservation planning here in the country. So I think I'm just running down through these comments. My thinking is I'm going to find somebody who can serve as a focal point for us for the red list process here in the center in Rwanda, and working, of course, with all the partners in the government. There's a lot of NGOs doing really great work here, as well as other government institutions and academic institutions. So I think we can come together with some coordination, do those modules, and then maybe come back to you with some questions and try to get started with maybe a few key taxonomic groups where we feel we have some of the expertise and some motivated people. Yeah. So I think we can end it there, where we went a little bit over, but I'm just so excited I have an internet connection again. So I'm really glad we had this group here, and I hope all of you that attended, you'll talk about this among your own networks and your departments and your units, and then keep your ears out, because we'll be following up. And, minimally your first step can be to follow the link that Dave posted. I just reposted it. And you can start doing the modules, and maybe we'll try to do some pushing so that we get a good core group trained, and then we can have a meeting here and see the next steps forward, and then get back in touch with Moni, Dave, and Gregory. So thank you all so much. I'm really appreciative of the time the three of you took. This has been really fantastic. And we recorded it, so we'll be circulating it for those that didn't get to attend, and especially alerting like the Rwanda Environment Management Authority and IUCN office here in Rwanda might be interested, plus so many other of our colleagues doing the biodiversity work. So I hope we stay in touch. And thank you again. Have a great afternoon or a great day, wherever you are. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us. We appreciate it.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Please
Yeah,
do.
Thank
thanks.
you.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Really great to meet you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.